The sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek as Judge Silas Beckett's gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Once a peaceful town where neighbors helping neighbors, Redemption Creek had fallen under the shadow of a man whose lust for power had corrupted the very foundation of justice. "Guilty," Beckett announced, his thin lips curling into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. "All three of you, guilty of cattle rustling and destruction of property." The three ranchers standing before him, Miller, Dawson, and Old Man Jenkins, exchanged desperate glances. Their weathered hands were bound, their faces etched with disbelief as the sentence was handed down for crimes they never committed. "By the power vested in me, I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. Sentence to be carried out at dawn 2 days hence." In the back of the courtroom, Sheriff Tom Henshaw shifted uncomfortably, his once proud badge now a heavy burden on his chest. There was a time when he'd have stood against such a miscarriage of justice, but those days were long gone. Now he was just another puppet dancing on Beckett's strings, forced to choose between his conscience and his family's safety. Outside, the townsfolk gathered in hushed clusters, fear keeping their voices low as the condemned men were led to the jailhouse. Beckett's enforcers, a collection of bounty hunters and hired guns, walked the streets freely, their very presence a threat to anyone thinking of standing against the judge. "This ain't right," whispered Martha Jenkins, her frail shoulders shaking as she watched her husband being taken away. "Those men never stole anything. It's those cattle barons working with Beckett who want our water rights." The past year had seen a dozen ranchers falsely accused, their properties mysteriously changing hands after their convictions. Some were buried in unmarked graves behind the church, others fled before Beckett's reach could find them. Those who remained lived with the knowledge that they could be next. As dusk settled over Redemption Creek, Mary Miller clutched her children close, knowing that by week's end, they'd be fatherless and homeless. In the saloon, men drank in somber silence, courage found at the bottom of whiskey glasses but never quite enough to act upon. "What happened to this town?" an old-timer muttered. "Used to be a good place." A stranger passing through set down his glass. "Heard talk of those ranchers being innocent." "Course they're innocent," the bartender replied, nervously wiping the same spot on the bar. "Everyone knows it, but knowing and proving are different things in Beckett's court." As the lamplights flickered across the darkening street, a young boy ran breathlessly into town, his eyes wide with something beyond fear. He burst into the saloon, hat in hand. "Riders!" he gasped. "3 of them, coming from the East Ridge." The piano player stopped mid-note. An old man at the corner table looked up, his rheumy eyes suddenly clear. "What kind of riders, boy?" he asked. "The kind that ride like they own the devil," the boy replied. "And one of them had a silver cross hanging from his saddle." The old man's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. "God help us," he whispered. "They're coming back." Have you ever lived in a town where corruption ruled everything? Tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed injustice that made your blood boil. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek with a blood-red hue that painted the mountains in crimson shadow. The town was barely stirring when 3 silhouettes appeared on the horizon, dust clouds rising behind them like vengeful spirits. As they approached, details emerged from the haze. 3 riders, their faces obscured by dust-covered hats, each man carrying the weight of years spent in the unforgiving frontier. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle, a worn Navy Colt holstered at his hip. His right hand, encased in a black leather glove, rested casually on the pommel. Jonah Iron Hand Kane, a man whose speed with a gun had become legend in territories from Texas to Montana. To his right rode a figure dressed in black, a silver cross glinting against his chest, Bible strapped alongside his Winchester. Elias, the preacher, Crow. Once a man of God who'd sworn to save souls until the day he learned that some men were beyond salvation. The third rider hung back slightly, a rifle case strapped to his saddle. Even from a distance, the hawk-like intensity of his gaze was unmistakable. Luke Deadeye Mercer, a sharpshooter who could pick a playing card at 300 yards. They rode straight down Main Street, hooves kicking up dust as townsfolk stopped to stare. Some of the older residents crossed themselves, others hustled children indoors. These men were ghosts from Redemption Creek's past, returning to a town that had changed in their absence. "Riders coming!" shouted one of Beckett's men, rushing toward the courthouse. The trio dismounted outside the saloon, tethering their horses with deliberate calm. Inside, conversation died as they pushed through the swinging doors. The bartender froze, recognition flooding his face. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "You boys picked a bad time to come home." Jonah approached the bar. "Heard there's to be a hanging." "Judge's orders. Best not interfere if you value your lives," the bartender warned, nervously polishing a glass. "This town belongs to Beckett now. Best ride on." Jonah removed his hat slowly, revealing a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, a mark left by Silas Beckett himself years ago. "Not anymore," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the saloon. 8 years earlier, Silas Beckett had arrived in Redemption Creek as a circuit judge with an impressive reputation for law and order. The town welcomed him, desperate for stability after a spate of robberies had left them vulnerable. No one questioned his methods when he first hanged an outlaw without proper trial. After all, the man was guilty, wasn't he? "You have to understand," Sheriff Henshaw explained to the 3 gunfighters, his voice low as they gathered in the back room of the general store. "It happened so gradually. First, it was just cutting corners with known outlaws. Then it was rushing judgments against strangers. Before you knew it, he was hanging innocent men for their land," Elias finished, his preacher's collar now tucked away in his saddlebag. Henshaw's eyes fell to the floor, shame evident in every line of his weathered face. "My wife and children. He threatened them directly, said they'd disappear if I didn't enforce his rulings." Outside, Clyde Maddox, Beckett's chief enforcer, rode past with his gang of 6. Men with hollow eyes and quick trigger fingers, they'd been hired for their willingness to kill without question. Locals scattered from their path like leaves before a storm. "That's them," Henshaw whispered. "Maddox killed the last man who spoke against the judge. Did it right in the street at noon, called it a fair fight, even though Pearson never even cleared leather." Luke peered through the window, studying each of Maddox's men with the calculating eye of a hunter. 7 men, not counting whatever rats hide in the courthouse. "Plus another dozen spread around town and the judge's estate," Henshaw added. The door creaked open, revealing Sarah Dawson, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her spine steel straight as she regarded the 3 men. As the wife of one of the condemned ranchers, she had the most to lose. "They say you've come to help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you 3 might stand against Beckett." Jonah stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've come to set things right. My husband hangs at dawn tomorrow. They've already built the scaffold." Her hands trembled, but her gaze remained steady. "They say you were once heroes in these parts." "Not heroes," Jonah corrected. "Just men who couldn't outrun their past." Sarah's eyes flashed. "I don't care what you call yourselves. I just need to know. Can you save him? Can you save them all?" The 3 men exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years riding together. "Justice is coming back to Redemption Creek," Elias promised. "One way or another." Midday heat shimmered over the dusty trail leading to the old Wilson Ranch as the 3 riders approached. The once thriving cattle operation now stood in quiet desolation, its fences broken and cattle long gone, another casualty of Beckett's reign. "You sure about this?" Luke asked, adjusting his rifle. "Old Man Wilson might not be the same gun hand he was during the Sutton County Wars." Jonah's eyes remained fixed on the ranch house ahead. "He was the best I ever saw. If there's anything left of that man, we need him." They found Jacob Wilson on his porch, rocking slowly, a Winchester across his lap and a half-empty bottle at his feet. At 70, his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes still carried the sharp glint of a predator. "Figured you boys might show up eventually," Wilson said without preamble. "Heard about the ranchers, heard about a lot of things since you three left." "Then you know why we're here," Jonah replied. Wilson spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I'm too old for gunfights." "You're too old to watch innocent men hang," Elias countered. After a long moment, Wilson set aside his bottle. "I got 6 rounds in this rifle. Reckon that'll have to do." Back in town, Deputy Marshal Hayes, barely 22 and still believing in the oath he'd taken, listened intently as the trio outlined their plan in the back of the livery stable. "Sheriff Henshaw's afraid," Hayes explained, "but there are others who'll fight if given the chance. Smithy, the stable master, the Callahan brothers who run the freight office." "We need more than a blacksmith and some freighters," Luke warned. "Then count me in too," Hayes said, standing straighter. "I swore to uphold the law, not Beckett's twisted version of it." As dusk approached, they'd assembled a ragtag group of 9 men willing to stand against Beckett's reign. Few had experience with firearms beyond hunting, but their determination was palpable. Their meeting was interrupted when the stable doors burst open. 2 of Maddox's men strode in, hands hovering near their pistols. "Well, look what we found," the taller one sneered. "A bunch of dead men planning their own funerals." Jonah stepped forward, his movements fluid and unhurried. "You boys ride for Beckett?" "What's it to you, stranger?" In one lightning motion, Jonah drew and fired, the bullet tearing through the man's gun hand. Before the second enforcer could clear leather, he found himself staring down Jonah's smoking barrel. "Tell your boss, Judge Beckett," Jonah said calmly. "His time's up." Word spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. Jonah Kane had returned and was gathering men to stand against Judge Beckett. By nightfall, the judge had summoned Clyde Maddox to his opulent estate on the edge of town, a property seized from a rancher who'd mysteriously died in his cell 2 years prior. "I want them dead by morning," Beckett ordered, pounding his fist on his mahogany desk. "Kane, the preacher, Mercer, all of them. I don't care how many men it takes." "They're holed up at the old Dawson place," Maddox replied, a cruel smile playing across his scarred face. "My boys are ready. It'll be a slaughter." As dawn broke, mist hung low over the valley surrounding the Dawson ranch. Luke sat perched in the hayloft of the barn, his rifle trained on the approach road. His breathing was slow and measured, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. "Riders coming," he called softly. "At least 15, armed heavy." Jonah positioned the men strategically around the property. Old Man Wilson took the north corner of the house, while Elias and the others spread throughout the outbuildings. The Callahan brothers, armed with shotguns, crouched behind an overturned wagon. "Remember," Jonah instructed, "let them get close before you fire. Make every shot count." The riders approached in a tight formation, dust billowing behind them as they galloped toward the ranch. When they were 50 yards out, the first shot rang out, Luke's rifle cracking the morning silence as Maddox's lead man toppled from his saddle. Chaos erupted, bullets tore through wood and glass as Maddox's men scattered, seeking cover. Luke's rifle spoke again and again, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. 3 more of Beckett's men fell before they could dismount. Elias rolled from behind a water trough, his twin Colts blazing as he took down 2 gunmen trying to flank the house. Inside, Deputy Hayes fired through a broken window, his inexperience evident in his wild shots, but his courage undeniable. "On your left!" Wilson shouted to Jonah as Maddox himself charged toward the barn, guns blazing. Jonah dove for cover as splinters exploded around him. Rolling to his feet, he drew and fired in one fluid motion. Maddox yelled in pain as the bullet grazed his shoulder, but kept charging. The 2 men collided in a brutal exchange of blows, their guns forgotten as they crashed through the barn door into the dusty yard. Maddox, younger and heavier, landed a punishing blow to Jonah's ribs. Jonah countered with an uppercut that sent blood spraying. "You should have stayed gone, Kane," Maddox growled, drawing a knife from his boot. "And miss seeing Beckett hang?" Jonah replied, circling warily. "Not a chance." The courthouse of Redemption Creek stood imposingly at the center of town, its white columns now stained with years of dust and neglect, much like the justice dispensed within its walls. The morning after the gunfight at Dawson's ranch, Judge Beckett called for a special session, determined to make an example of the condemned ranchers before Kane's resistance could gain further ground. Townspeople filed into the crowded gallery, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was to come. The scaffold visible through the windows served as a stark reminder of Beckett's power. At the front of the room, Miller, Dawson, and Jenkins sat in chains, their bruised faces testament to the justice they'd received in Beckett's jail. "This court is now in session," Beckett announced, his black robe swirling as he took his seat at the bench. His face, once handsome, had grown jowled with excess and cruelty. "Before we proceed with the sentencing review, I wish to remind everyone that disturbing the peace of this court is punishable by imprisonment." 4 armed guards stood at attention around the room, hands resting on their holstered pistols. Sheriff Henshaw stood near the door, his eyes darting nervously between the judge and the gathered crowd. "Bring forth the first witness," Beckett commanded. A thin, rat-faced man named Harper approached the stand. As one of Beckett's land agents, he'd testified in dozens of these sham trials. "Tell us again what you saw on the night of April 15th, Beckett prompted. "Just like I said before," Harper began, his rehearsed testimony flowing smoothly. "I saw these 3 men driving stolen cattle across Campbell's property. When confronted, they set fire to his south pasture to cover their escape. In the back row, 3 figures sat quietly, a preacher, a dusty traveler, and an old man with spectacles. None spoke as the false testimony continued, though the old man's hand occasionally moved to adjust his eyeglasses, a signal to others hidden among the crowd. "The evidence is indisputable," Beckett declared after the final witness. "The sentence stands, hanging to be carried out at sunrise tomorrow." The condemned men's families wept quietly, knowing protest meant joining their loved ones on the scaffold. But as Beckett rose to leave, a voice cut through the murmurs. "If I may address the court, Your Honor." All heads turned as Elias stood, removing his preacher's collar and hat. Recognition dawned on many faces. The preacher had returned. "This proceeding is closed," Beckett snapped, his face flushing. "Then perhaps," Elias replied calmly, reaching inside his coat, "we should open a new one." The room went deathly silent as guards reached for their weapons. "This ain't justice," Elias declared. "It's murder." The courthouse erupted into chaos. As Elias stepped forward, Jonah and Luke rose simultaneously, their hands moving with practiced precision. The first guard managed only half a draw before Luke's bullet took him in the shoulder. The second fired wildly, his shot splintering the wooden banister as Jonah's return fire sent him sprawling. "Everyone down!" Jonah shouted to the civilians as he vaulted over the bench, heading straight for the chained ranchers. Judge Beckett stumbled backward, his face twisted with rage and terror. "Kill them!" he screamed to his remaining men. "Kill them all!" Elias slid across a table, his twin Colts blazing as he provided covering fire. The windows shattered, raining glass onto the screaming crowd as people dove for cover beneath benches and tables. In the confusion, Sheriff Henshaw made his decision. Drawing his weapon, he turned and fired, not at the intruders, but at the guard aiming for Jonah's back. "Henshaw, you traitor!" Beckett snarled as he retreated toward his chambers, dragging a clerk as a human shield. "No more innocent blood, Judge," Henshaw replied, standing firm for the first time in years. "This ends today." Jonah reached the prisoners, keys taken from a fallen guard jingling in his hand as he freed them from their shackles. "Can you ride?" he asked Miller, who nodded despite his battered condition. "My family," Dawson began. "Already safe," Jonah assured him. "Sarah's waiting at Wilson's ranch with the others." Outside, gunfire echoed through the streets as the remainder of their makeshift resistance engaged Beckett's men positioned around the courthouse. The Callahan brothers, armed with shotguns, cleared a path to the waiting horses as Luke provided precision fire from the bell tower of the adjacent church. "The judge is escaping through the back," a voice called out. Hayes, the young deputy, pointing toward the rear exit, where Beckett was being hustled into a waiting carriage by 2 guards. Jonah rushed to the window, pistol raised, but the carriage was already speeding away in a cloud of dust. "Let him run," he said grimly. "We've got what we came for." By the time the gun smoke cleared, 3 of Beckett's men lay dead, several more wounded, and the condemned ranchers were free. But the price had been steep. 2 of their own resistance fighters had fallen, and the town was now irrevocably divided. Some citizens had joined their cause openly, while others barricaded themselves in their homes, terrified of the judge's inevitable retribution. That evening, as they regrouped at Wilson's ranch, the scale of their challenge became clear. Riders had been spotted leaving town in all directions, Beckett calling in every gun for hire and corrupt lawmen in the territory. "We've won the first battle," Elias observed as they buried their fallen comrades beneath an old oak tree. "But the war's just beginning." Henshaw, still wearing his sheriff's badge, though now a marked man, nodded solemnly. "Beckett won't stop, not until every one of us is dead, or he is." "Then we'd best make sure it's him," Jonah replied, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where dust clouds signaled the approach of more riders. "Because I didn't come back just to die in this godforsaken town." Night descended on Wilson's ranch like a shroud, the darkness broken only by the faint glow of lanterns carefully shielded to prevent them from becoming targets. The families of the freed ranchers huddled in the main house, while Jonah and the others fortified the perimeter, knowing Beckett's retaliation would come swiftly and without mercy. "Riders approaching from the south ridge," Luke called out from his position in the barn loft. "Moving slow, trying to stay hidden." Jonah nodded to Elias, who quickly shepherded the civilians into the root cellar. "How many?" he asked, checking his Colt cylinder. "At least 20, Luke replied. "Spread wide. They've learned from this morning." Old Man Wilson settled into position behind a stack of hay bales, his weathered hands steady on his rifle despite his age. "Reminds me of the Sutton Creek ambush in '62, he muttered. "Outnumbered then, too." A tense silence fell over the ranch as they waited, broken only by the soft whicker of horses and the whispered prayers of the frightened families below. When the first muzzle flash lit up the darkness at the edge of the property, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides as Beckett's men charged. Luke's rifle cracked rhythmically, each shot finding its mark with unerring precision. But for every man that fell, 2 more seemed to materialize from the darkness. "They're trying to reach the barn!" Sheriff Henshaw shouted as a group of riders broke through their defensive line. The night exploded in flame as a burning torch sailed through the air, landing on the barn's hay-strewn roof. Within seconds, the dry timber caught, fire racing up the walls toward where Luke was positioned. "Luke, get out of there!" Jonah yelled, providing covering fire as Mercer scrambled down from his rapidly disintegrating perch. He'd barely cleared the barn doors when the roof collapsed in a shower of burning debris. Flames illuminated the battle scene in hellish orange light, revealing the full extent of the assault. Beckett's men were everywhere, their bullets splintering wood and tearing through flesh with terrible efficiency. Wilson rose to reload, exposing himself for just a moment too long. The bullet took him high in the chest, spinning him backward into the dirt. Jonah reached him first, cradling the old gunfighter's head. "Always figured I'd die with a gun in my hand," Wilson gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Make the judge pay, Kane. For all of us." As Wilson's eyes closed for the final time, something hardened in Jonah's expression. A cold, implacable resolve that transformed grief into deadly purpose. By dawn, the battle at Wilson's ranch had ended in a stalemate. Beckett's men had retreated, leaving their dead behind, while Jonah and the survivors had slipped away through a hidden ravine, carrying their wounded. The old gunfighter's death weighed heavily on them all. but none more than Jonah, whose quiet rage had transformed into something cold and purposeful. They regrouped in an abandoned silver mine outside town, where Doc Preston, once the town's physician before Beckett ran him out for treating an enemy of the court, tended to their wounds. 3 of their band were dead, including Wilson, and several more injured too badly to fight. "We can't win like this," Luke observed, cleaning his rifle methodically. "They'll just keep coming until we're all dead." Jonah stood at the mouth of the mine, staring toward town. "Then we change the game," he said finally. "Clyde Maddox is Beckett's right hand. Without him, the others are just hired guns with no real loyalty." "What are you suggesting?" Sheriff Henshaw asked, though the dread in his eyes suggested he already knew. "I'm calling him out. High noon, Main Street." Elias stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "That's exactly what Beckett wants. Get you out in the open, probably have sharpshooters on every roof." "Probably," Jonah agreed. "That's why I need you and Luke to make sure it's a fair fight." By mid-morning, a lone rider carried Jonah's message into Redemption Creek. The challenge spread through town like wildfire. Jonah Iron Hand Kane was calling out Clyde Maddox to settle their score once and for all. At precisely noon, Jonah walked slowly down Main Street, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The town had emptied, doors locked and windows shuttered, though watching eyes peered through every crack. Judge Beckett sat on his courthouse balcony, a malevolent smile playing across his lips as he awaited the death of his most troublesome enemy. Clyde Maddox emerged from the saloon, the bandage on his shoulder from their previous encounter a reminder of unfinished business. He sauntered into the street, confidence radiating from every pore. "You should have stayed gone, Kane," he called out, positioning himself 30 paces away. "Couldn't leave," Jonah replied evenly. "Not while men like you and Beckett are still breathing." Maddox's hand hovered near his holster. "After today, one of us won't be." A terrible stillness fell over the town as both men stood motionless, measuring each other across the sun-baked dirt. In the bell tower, Luke's rifle was trained on a Beckett gunman, hidden on the general store roof. Behind the livery, Elias had his pistol aimed at another concealed in the alley. The clock struck 12. Both hands moved in a blur of motion. The crack of gunfire split the air as both men drew. Jonah felt Maddox's bullet tear through the flesh of his left arm, but his own shot found its mark with devastating accuracy. Maddox staggered backward, a look of disbelief washing over his face as a crimson stain blossomed across his chest. He managed one more step before crumpling face first into the dirt, his pistol falling from lifeless fingers. From his perch on the courthouse balcony, Judge Beckett's triumphant expression crumbled into rage. "Kill him!" he screamed to his hidden gunman. "Kill all of them!" Shots rang out from rooftops and windows, but Luke's rifle had already silenced the sharpshooter on the general store. Elias emerged from hiding, firing with deadly precision at another of Beckett's men in the alley. The street erupted into chaos as the battle they'd been building toward finally exploded across Redemption Creek. Sheriff Henshaw led a charge from the side streets, joined by townspeople who'd finally found the courage to stand against their oppressor. The blacksmith wielded his hammer with terrible efficiency, while the Callahan brothers laid down covering fire from behind an overturned wagon. "The courthouse!" Jonah shouted above the din, clutching his bleeding arm. "Beckett's making a run for it!" Through the gunsmoke, they could see the judge retreating inside, surrounded by his remaining loyal guards. The massive oak doors slammed shut as Beckett barricaded himself in his fortress of corruption. "We need to end this now," Elias said, reloading his pistols, "before more innocent blood is spilled." Luke nodded grimly. "I'll cover the back exit. He's not escaping this time." As night fell, Redemption Creek became a battleground. Buildings caught fire from stray gunfire, their flames illuminating the desperate struggle that spread through every street and alley. For every citizen who joined their cause, another cowered in fear or actively fought to protect the status quo that had benefited them under Beckett's reign. Jonah, his wound hastily bandaged, led the final assault on the courthouse. They broke through the doors in a hail of gunfire, fighting room by room up toward Beckett's chambers. The judge's hired guns fought with the desperation of men who knew. Defeat meant the hangman's noose. "It's over, Silas," Jonah called out as they reached the judge's ornate office door. "Come out and face what you've done." A shot splintered the wood near his head. Beckett's answer. Elias glanced at Jonah. "Remember what you told me when I first rode with you? Sometimes a man has to decide which weighs more, justice or mercy." Jonah checked his revolver. 2 bullets left. "Some men don't deserve mercy." With a mighty kick, they burst through the door to find Beckett standing behind his desk, a shotgun aimed at the entrance. Before he could fire, Luke's rifle shot from the window shattered his hand. The shotgun clattered to the floor as Beckett howled in pain and rage. "You've destroyed everything!" Beckett screamed, clutching his mangled hand. "This town was mine! Mine!" Jonah advanced slowly, his gun trained on the judge's heart. "This town belongs to its people, and you're going to answer for every innocent life you've taken." Beckett backed against the wall, his arrogance finally crumbling into naked fear. "Please," he whimpered, "I can pay you. More money than you've ever seen." "I ain't here for money," Jonah replied coldly. "I'm here for justice." The first rays of dawn broke over Redemption Creek, illuminating a town forever changed. Smoke still rose from the burned-out husk of the saloon, and bullet holes pockmarked the once pristine facades of Main Street. But mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder and ash was something else. The unmistakable scent of freedom. Judge Silas Beckett's body had been removed from the courthouse. His reign of terror ended not by the hangman's noose he so often employed, but by Jonah Kane's unwavering justice. The remaining hired guns had either fled or surrendered when news of the judge's death spread through town like a cleansing fire. In the town square, Sheriff Henshaw addressed the gathered citizens, his badge polished for the first time in years. "Today marks a new beginning for Redemption Creek," he announced, his voice steady and clear. "No more will the scales of justice be tipped by greed and corruption. From this day forward, the law will protect all citizens equally." The crowd's response was subdued, not from disagreement, but from the weight of all they had endured and the uncertain path ahead. Some faces showed relief, others apprehension, and a few displayed the lingering doubt of those who had prospered under Beckett's corrupt system. Near the back of the crowd, Jonah, Elias, and Luke stood quietly, bandaged but unbowed. The 3 ranchers they had saved, Miller, Dawson, and Jenkins, approached with extended hands and tears in their eyes. "We can never repay what you've done," Dawson said, his voice thick with emotion. Jonah shook his head. "Live free and treat your neighbors right. That's payment enough." As the townspeople dispersed to begin rebuilding, the 3 gunfighters retreated to the shade of the old oak tree behind the church. Fresh graves marked those who had fallen in the fight for justice, Wilson, Hayes, and others whose sacrifice would not be forgotten. "What happens now?" Luke asked, cleaning his rifle one final time before returning it to its case. Elias gazed thoughtfully at the horizon. Redemption Creek will heal. Towns always do, given time. "And us?" Luke pressed. Jonah watched as Sheriff Henshaw organized volunteers to repair the damaged buildings. The man stood straighter now, his purpose restored along with his honor. "Our work here is done," Jonah replied. "There are other towns, other Becketts, always will be." They gathered their few possessions and saddled their horses as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rebuilding town. A small crowd gathered to see them off, the freed ranchers and their families, shopkeepers who had secretly supported their cause, and children who already whispered legends of the 3 riders who had brought justice back to Redemption Creek. Sheriff Henshaw approached, hat in hand. "You know, you could stay," he offered. "Help us rebuild. This could be home again." Jonah smiled faintly, the hardness in his eyes softening for just a moment. "Some men aren't meant to put down roots, Sheriff. We're needed elsewhere." As they rode out, the setting sun at their backs, the townsfolk of Redemption Creek stood tall, for the first time in years. No longer would they live in fear of corrupt power. No longer would justice be a commodity sold to the highest bidder. "You think they'll be all right?" Elias asked as the town receded into the distance. Jonah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon and whatever awaited them beyond. "They're free now. The rest is up to them." 3 silhouettes against the blood-red sunset, riding toward whatever injustice awaited their particular brand of remedy. Not heroes, just men who understood that sometimes the price of freedom was paid in blood, and who were willing to pay it when others could not. If you enjoyed this tale of justice in the Old West, let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against corruption? Drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe for more legendary stories of courage and redemption.